April 7, 1942, over the South Pacific. The morning sun glints off the ocean as a lone American P-40 claws through the humid air, its engine straining, its pilot fighting the controls as sweat runs down the inside of his goggles. He's young, barely trained, and the aircraft beneath him feels heavy, unresponsive, built for a different kind of fight. Above him, cutting effortless circles in the sky, a Mitsubishi A6M0 glides into position. Its pilot tilts his wings, almost playfully. The Japanese fighter floats with impossible lightness, closing the distance without urgency, as though the outcome has already been written. The P-40 dives in desperation. The Zero simply rises, pivots, and drops behind him in seconds. Tracers snap past the canopy. Metal screams. The American pilot never even sees his attacker's face, only the shadows sweeping across his cockpit as his aircraft spirals downward. For months, scenes like this repeat across the Pacific. U.S. fighters outclassed, outmaneuvered, and openly mocked by opponents who believed the sky belonged to them. But the war is still young. And far from this battlefield, a new machine is being shaped, one that will rewrite everything.
In the early months of 1942, the Pacific War unfolded with a brutal clarity that stunned the United States. The Japanese Empire, driven by momentum and years of preparation, swept across the region with an air force that seemed almost untouchable. At the center of that dominance was a fighter few Americans had ever heard of before the war, the Mitsubishi A6M0. Light, agile, and flown by seasoned aviators, it carved through early U.S. squadrons with a combination of experience, engineering, and tactical cohesion that had been years in the making. The United States, by contrast, entered the conflict with a mix of aircraft that were never designed for the type of aerial combat the Pacific demanded. Fighters like the P-36, P-39 Airacobra, and P-40 Warhawk were sturdy and capable in certain conditions, but they lacked the instant climb, tight turn radius, and endurance that allowed Japanese pilots to dictate when and where engagements occurred. American pilots often found themselves fighting uphill, both literally and figuratively. Many were newly trained, lacking combat experience, and thrown into desperate battles to defend ground that was rapidly disappearing beneath them. Reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies painted the same picture. Japanese fighters attacking from above, striking with precision, and vanishing before U.S. aircraft could reposition. Pilots described how Zeros seemed almost to hover in the sky, pivoting around heavier American machines with a grace that felt unfair, even supernatural. Some U.S. aviators joked grimly that dogfighting a Zero was like boxing someone who weighed half as much but could hit twice as fast. Others spoke of how their aircraft simply couldn't keep up. When they tried to turn, the Zero tightened its circle. When they tried to climb, it shot upward like a kite caught on a strong wind. Yet the aircraft alone didn't explain the imbalance. Japanese naval aviators had trained under an unforgiving system that demanded thousands of flight hours, strict discipline, and mastery of air combat tactics. By the time war erupted, many had flown in China, testing maneuvers and coordinating as cohesive units. They entered the Pacific conflict with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of having already fought and refined their approach in real wartime conditions. American pilots, on the other hand, came from a peacetime training doctrine that emphasized safety, basic aerobatics, and limited air-to-air maneuvering. Their first true lessons came at the worst possible moment, in combat against a veteran enemy. Losses mounted quickly. It wasn't uncommon for U.S. fighters to be shot down before they even understood how the Zero was maneuvering around them. And as these stories spread, so did the belief among Japanese pilots that their machines and their skills were unquestionably superior. Some Japanese aces openly mocked American aircraft, calling them clumsy or slow. Others joked that U.S. fighters were targets, not opponents. In their eyes, American technology and training simply couldn't match the standard Japan had built before the war. And in those early months, the battlefield seemed to prove them right. But even in defeat, the Americans observed. Pilots who survived engagements brought back crucial information about the Zero's structure, its lightweight construction, and its vulnerabilities. Intelligence teams began piecing together how the aircraft gained its agility and what trade-offs had been made to achieve it. Engineers studied everything from damage directs to pilot testimonies. A clearer picture emerged. The Zero was lethal, but not invincible. Behind the scenes, the U.S. aviation industry was already searching for answers. North American Aviation, a young but ambitious company, had been approached by the British before the war with a request for a modern fighter. From that request, a new airframe was taking shape, sleek, fast, and built with a different philosophy. What no one yet realized was that this aircraft, still in development and not fully understood by its own designers, would eventually reshape the air war entirely. But in early 1942, all of that remained hidden in workshops and test fields. On the front lines, American pilots still climbed into machines that struggled to match their opponents. And in the skies above the Pacific, Japanese aviators continued to believe that their dominance was permanent. What they couldn't see was that the United States was already beginning a transformation, one that would soon move from desperation to innovation, and from innovation to overwhelming superiority.
As 1942 progressed, the United States faced a truth that would shape its entire wartime aviation strategy. Victory in the Pacific would depend on reach. The theater was vast, scattered across thousands of miles of open ocean, with airfields separated by distances that pushed aircraft to their limits. Any fighter that hoped to influence the war needed speed, altitude performance, firepower, but above all, range. Without it, American bombers, patrol aircraft, and invasion forces would remain exposed to the same attacks that had devastated them during the war's first months. While U.S. Navy and Marine Corps squadrons fought desperate defensive battles using what they had, another effort took shape far from combat, in factories, drafting rooms, and wind tunnels. There, engineers and military planners were searching for something fundamentally different from the aircraft that had struggled so badly against the Zero. And it was during this period that an unexpected request from Britain set off a chain of events that would redefine American air power. In 1940, before the United States entered the war, the British Purchasing Commission had approached North American aviation with an urgent need. They wanted a modern fighter to supplement their Spitfires and Hurricanes, something new, fast, and ready as soon as possible. North American offered an ambitious proposal. Rather than build an existing design under license, they would create an entirely new aircraft from scratch. The result was the NA-73X, the prototype of what would become the P-51 Mustang. Designed in just 117 days, the early Mustang featured a streamlined fuselage, laminar flow wings, and remarkable aerodynamic efficiency. It was, on paper, one of the fastest and most advanced fighter designs of its generation. In its initial form, however, it carried a limitation that few recognized at first. The Allison V1710 engine, while reliable at lower altitudes, suffered a steep performance drop above 15,000 feet. In Europe, where combat often took place at high altitude, this shortcoming would become decisive. British pilots testing the early Mustang noticed its potential immediately. At low altitude, it was extraordinarily fast, faster than the Spitfire in some conditions. Its range was impressive, and its handling was smooth, but without high-altitude performance, its usefulness as an air superiority fighter seemed limited. The British employed it mostly for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions, where its speed and stability shone, but the aircraft's true ceiling had not yet been unlocked. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Army Air Forces were still searching for a solution to the pressing problem of escorting bombers. The B-17 and later B-24 bombers were designed under the doctrine of self-defending formations, a belief that densely packed groups of heavily armed aircraft could fight their way to the target and back. In the European air campaign,
That idea was already unraveling. By 1943, American bombers were suffering catastrophic losses over Germany once they outran their escorts. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were formidable fighters, but their range was still insufficient to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The search for an escort fighter grew urgent. Engineers, commanders, and pilots debated possible solutions. Could drop tanks extend the range of existing fighters? Could new tactics reduce exposure? Could bombers operate at different altitudes to avoid interception? Each idea provided partial relief, but none solved the core problem. What the United States needed was an aircraft that could fly far, fly fast, climb high, fight hard, and still have the endurance to return. The breakthrough came when British engineers proposed mating the Mustang's advanced airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire and Hurricane so effective. Tests immediately revealed stunning results. The Merlin-powered Mustang, soon designated the P-51B, climbed faster, flew higher, and moved with an authority that rivaled anything in the sky. Suddenly, the limitations that had held the early Mustang back disappeared. What remained was a fighter unmatched in speed, range, and high-altitude performance. The United States had found its answer, but the aircraft's transformation alone didn't guarantee dominance. It still needed pilots, tactics, deployment, and the chance to prove itself against the opponent that had humiliated American fighters in 1942. By late 1943, as the new Mustang variants rolled out of factories into squadrons, the stage was set for a shift so dramatic that neither American nor Japanese pilots fully anticipated it. The aircraft that had begun as a British request, refined through American engineering and British testing, was about to shape the final years of the Pacific and European air wars. And in the Pacific, where the Zero had once ruled without challenge, a new contender was preparing to enter the fight.
When the Mustang first appeared on airfields in meaningful numbers, it entered a world shaped by 2 years of imbalance. The Japanese Zero had built its reputation not only through engineering, but through the way it rewrote air combat expectations. Its pilots believed that tight turning, rapid acceleration, and instantaneous climb were the defining measures of superiority. For early American fighters, those standards were impossible to match. But when the P-51 emerged, it did so on radically different terms. Rather than trying to outturn the Zero, it embraced a new kind of air combat, one built around speed, altitude, and the decisive use of energy. The technological contrast between early U.S. fighters and the Zero had been painfully clear in 1942. The Zero's lightweight structure, long-range capability, and impressive low-speed maneuverability were ideal for the early Pacific War. Japanese engineers had designed it for an environment where agility mattered most and where risk could be balanced by pilot skill. In contrast, American fighters of the same period were rooted in a philosophy that valued durability and firepower. This difference produced entirely different battle outcomes. The Zero could choose when to fight, how to fight, and when to disengage. The Americans could only respond. The Mustang changed that equation. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag at high speeds. Its Merlin engine delivered power at altitudes the Zero could barely reach. Its airframe maintained structural integrity even under aggressive diving maneuvers that would have torn earlier fighters apart. Suddenly, U.S. pilots found themselves flying in aircraft that didn't play by the Zero's rules. Instead of entering turning contests they could never win, they began using altitude to dictate engagements. Instead of bleeding speed in prolonged maneuvers, they struck once and disappeared. This shift in tactics, from reactive to assertive, would later define the character of American air superiority. Training shaped the next angle of transformation. Japanese naval aviators at the beginning of the war were among the most experienced in the world. Many had fought in China, flying hundreds of operational hours before meeting their first American opponent. Their training pipeline was strict, narrow, and deeply selective. But the system had a weakness. It was slow. Every pilot lost was difficult to replace. The United States, by contrast, could expand its training programs, refine its curriculum, and begin producing pilots at a scale Japan could not match. When the Mustang entered service, it did so alongside aviators who benefited from 2 years of accelerated doctrine, field reports, and tactical evolution. The psychological shift was equally significant. When American pilots first engaged the Zero in 1942, many carried a sense of caution born from experience. They knew their aircraft could not match the Zero in a turn, and they learned these lessons under fire. But by the time the Mustang arrived, those same pilots were flying with renewed confidence. They finally possessed an aircraft whose strengths were clear, repeatable, and overwhelming when used correctly. The P-51 wasn't simply a machine, it was a strategy embodied in metal and fuel. Tactics evolved quickly. Mustang pilots prioritized altitude, forming loose, flexible formations that allowed individual aircraft to break off and attack from above at high speed. They relied on boom and zoom streaks, where a single pass delivered enough firepower to cripple opponents before the Mustang climbed back into the sky, still holding the energy advantage. Against the Zero, which excelled at close-in maneuvering but suffered from structural fragility and limited high-speed handling, these tactics were devastating. The first encounters revealed an unmistakable truth. When the battle took place on Mustang terms, the Zero was outmatched. Yet the impact of the Mustang was not only tactical, it was strategic. Its range allowed it to escort bombers across distances the Zero could not challenge effectively. Its speed allowed it to sweep ahead of formations, clearing the skies long before bombers arrived, and its reliability allowed it to operate from forward bases with minimal maintenance, a crucial advantage as U.S. forces pushed deeper into Pacific territory. All of these developments began forming a picture the Japanese had not expected. The Americans were no longer fielding aircraft that existed as targets to be mocked, but machines that embodied a new philosophy of air power. This shift was not immediate, nor was it universally understood at first. But with each new squadron equipped, with each newly trained pilot taking to the air, and with each report sent back from the front, the narrative began to change. In the same way that early war American pilots once looked up and saw Zeros circling above them with casual confidence, Japanese pilots were beginning to see something different. A fighter approaching from high altitude at a speed they could not match, diving with precision, striking with force, and climbing away before they could react. The rules of the sky were changing, and both sides sensed it. As these shifts took root, they prepared the ground for a deeper transformation, one that would be felt not just in individual dogfights, but across entire campaigns.
As the Mustang entered combat in greater numbers, a second set of forces began reshaping the air war. Forces rooted not in tactics alone, but in the industrial and logistical weight of the United States. Japan had entered the conflict with a highly refined but narrowly scaled aviation industry. Its factories were capable of producing excellent aircraft, yet they operated under constraints that limited long-term output. Skilled labor was difficult to replace. Raw materials were restricted, and the Zero itself relied on specialized construction that took time to complete. When experienced pilots and aircraft were lost, the system strained under the burden. The United States faced no such limitations. Once mobilized, American industry operated with an intensity Japan could not match. Assembly lines expanded, production schedules compressed, and aircraft rolled out of factories in numbers that stunned enemy analysts. The Mustang benefited directly from this surge. Engines, airframes, replacement parts, and fuel arrived in quantities that ensured squadrons could maintain readiness even under sustained combat. Every pilot who stepped into a P-51 knew that the machine beneath him represented more than engineering. It represented the industrial heartbeat of a nation that had committed itself fully to winning the war. Range became the next decisive dimension. In the Pacific, where islands lay scattered across immense distances, the ability to travel far without sacrificing combat performance was transformative. The Zero possessed impressive range for its size, yet it was designed around a lightweight, fuel-efficient philosophy that left little room for armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. The Mustang approached the problem differently. With drop tanks, it could travel extraordinary distances, reaching deep into contested airspace while still retaining enough fuel for combat. When based from Iwo Jima in 1945, P-51s could escort B-29 bombers all the way to Japan and return, something no American fighter had been able to do effectively before. This reach meant that for the first time, American bombers did not have to fly alone into territory controlled by Japanese interceptors. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. For Japanese pilots, the appearance of Mustangs over the home islands signaled a new chapter in the war. They had once mocked early U.S. fighters for their sluggish performance and predictable vulnerabilities, but now they faced an aircraft that turned those assumptions upside down. The Mustang could climb faster, dive harder, and catch them even when they believed they were safely out of range. Its guns, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, delivered concentrated fire that tore through aircraft built with minimal armor. For aviators who had long relied on maneuverability as their primary defense, the sudden presence of a fighter that could dictate every aspect of the engagement was a shock few had anticipated. For American pilots, the shift brought something long absent from early Pacific battles: initiative. With the Mustang, they didn't wait for the enemy to appear. They hunted them. They ranged ahead of bomber formations, patrolling airspace where enemy fighters might gather. They intercepted attackers long before they reached their targets. Instead of reacting to Japanese maneuvers, they established control over altitude and direction. Even seasoned Japanese aces found themselves facing a foe that no longer yielded advantages in the way earlier U.S. fighters had. As the tide continued to turn, another angle emerged: the rapid decline of Japan's veteran pilot corps. Early in the war, Japanese aviators were among the most skilled anywhere in the world, but Japan's training system, designed for small elite groups, could not keep pace with mounting losses. When the Mustang entered the Pacific theater in significant numbers, the opponents it met were no longer the same experienced force that had dominated the early war. Many were younger, less experienced, flying older aircraft or rapidly produced models like the K-43 or K-84. Against the Mustang's speed and altitude advantage, they faced impossible odds. Yet the Mustang's dominance was not simply a story of replacing one aircraft with another. It represented a broader evolution in American air doctrine, a shift toward air superiority as a prerequisite for any major campaign. The Mustang allowed the United States to impose this principle across the Pacific. It ensured bombers could reach their targets, protected naval operations, and weakened Japan's ability to contest the skies. Each of these angles, industrial strength, tactical evolution, strategic range, pilot adaptation, and enemy attrition, converged into a single reality. Japanese pilots who had once laughed at American aircraft now faced a machine that embodied every advantage they had enjoyed early in the war and more. The fighter they had underestimated had finally arrived, and it carried with it a new kind of war, one Japan was no longer prepared to meet. As these pressures converged, the stage was set for the decisive turning point, when the Mustang would prove not only superior in isolated engagements, but transformative across entire operations.
By early 1944, the Mustang had already proven itself in Europe, but its defining moment in the Pacific was still ahead. The vast distances, scattered islands, and relentless pressure of Japanese air defenses demanded a fighter that could not only defeat enemy aircraft, but remain in the sky long enough to reshape entire missions. When U.S. forces captured the Marianas and secured Iwo Jima in early 1945, the conditions finally aligned for the P-51 to demonstrate what it could truly do. From airfields carved into volcanic rock, Mustangs began launching on missions no fighter had attempted before, escorting B-29 Superfortress bombers across nearly 1,500 miles of open ocean to the Japanese home islands. It was a route filled with storms, unpredictable winds, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure. For the pilots of the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups, the journey alone was a test of endurance. Many had never flown such distances. Others understood that if they were forced to ditch, the cold Pacific offered little chance of survival. Yet each mission carried the same purpose: reach Japan, protect the bombers, and break what remained of Japan's aerial strength. Japanese pilots were not expecting the new threat. For years, bomber formations had approached alone, giving defenders time to climb, assemble, and strike with coordinated force. But now, long before the B-29s appeared, small shapes descended from high altitude, Mustangs spreading across the sky like a net. They swept ahead, searching for enemy fighters gathering for takeoff, circling above airfields, waiting for any sign of movement. For the first time, Japan's defending units found themselves attacked before they could climb to altitude. Fighters that once launched confidently into combat were destroyed seconds after leaving the runway. When dogfights did break out, the encounters exposed a growing disparity. The Zero remained lethal in the hands of experienced pilots, but those pilots were now few. Fuel shortages limited practice flights. Maintenance crews struggled with scarcity of parts. And many newer aircraft models, though promising on paper, had not been refined or produced in numbers large enough to influence the war. Against this backdrop, the Mustang entered combat with every possible advantage: speed, altitude, firepower, endurance, and pilots trained under a system designed for continuous improvement. Combat reports from early missions showed Japanese pilots stunned by the Mustang's presence. Some attempted to climb, believing they could reach the high-altitude position they once used to their advantage, but the Mustang was already there. Others tried to dive away, only to find the Mustang still behind them, gaining speed in controlled descents the Zero's lighter frame could not sustain. Even head-on attacks, once a desperate but viable tactic, became dangerous as Mustang pilots used their superior stability and armament to fire earlier and more accurately. For bomber crews watching these engagements unfold, the difference was unmistakable. In early Pacific battles, the approach to target areas were moments of fear. Formations tightened, gunners scanned the sky nervously, and every distant speck triggered a wave of tension. Now they saw Mustangs weaving above and ahead, clearing paths, breaking up enemy formations, or driving Japanese fighters downward long before they reached firing range. What had once been a direct struggle for survival had become a coordinated demonstration of air control. Japanese commanders recognized the change immediately. Reports described an enemy fighter that could reach any altitude, climb with great speed, and continue pursuit when older aircraft must disengage. Some pilots described it as an opponent that simply appeared out of the sun, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished back into the sky. The psychological shock deepened as losses mounted. Veterans who had once mocked early American designs now advised younger pilots to avoid the Mustang whenever possible. The shift was undeniable. The airspace Japan once dominated was slipping away. Yet the climax of the Mustang's arrival in the Pacific was not defined by a single battle. It emerged gradually, mission by mission, as the aircraft imposed itself across the theater. Escort missions became offensive sweeps. Defensive patrols became interdictions. The Mustang's role expanded, then expanded again, until it shaped nearly every major aerial operation of 1945. As these missions multiplied, they pushed Japan's remaining forces into a position they could no longer escape, a position where the sky itself had become contested ground, where every climb was dangerous, and where every sortie risked collapse before the battle even began. The shift was complete.
But the most dramatic stage of the Mustang's dominance, the final dismantling of Japan's ability to challenge American air power, was still ahead.
As the Mustang's presence intensified over Japan, its missions evolved from mere escort duty into sweeping offensives designed to erase what remained of Japanese air resistance. By mid-1945, the fighter groups operating from Iwo Jima were no longer simply protecting bombers. They were dismantling the enemy's air power at its foundations. Each new sortie pushed deeper into the Japanese mainland, striking airfields, intercepting formations, and hunting down isolated aircraft that rose in desperation to defend their cities. The final stage of the aerial struggle revealed how thoroughly the balance had shifted. Japan's veteran aviators, the men who had once flown with confidence against American formations, had been thinned by years of attrition. Those who remained faced an opponent equipped with a machine far beyond the early war fighters they had mocked. Many new pilots entering the ranks had received only minimal training, often limited to basic handling and emergency procedures. Fuel was scarce, engines were unreliable, aircraft were rushed into service with incomplete inspections. It was a force that still fought with courage, but no longer with the foundation that had made it formidable in 1941 and 1942. Against this weakened defense, the Mustang became not only a superior fighter, but an overwhelming force. Interceptions that once lasted minutes now ended in seconds. Dogfights rarely developed into prolonged engagements. The Mustang's speed and climb performance allowed its pilots to determine when battles began and when they ended. The Zero, which had once danced around heavier American fighters with ease, now struggled to maintain an angle of attack. Attempts to turn with a Mustang resulted in lost energy. Attempts to escape in a dive resulted in structural stress the Zero was never designed to withstand. Even the newer Japanese types, such as the K-84 and the K-100, fought bravely but lacked the numbers, fuel, and pilot quality necessary to change the course of battle. Escort missions increasingly turned into sweeps in which Mustangs arrived over Japanese airfields before defenders could organize. Some pilots described circling above runways, watching enemy aircraft line up for takeoff, then diving to disrupt any attempt to launch. Others recalled finding entire formations assembling near the coasts, only to strike with coordinated passes that scattered opponents before combat even began. The psychological effect of these encounters was profound. Japan's air defenses, once confident in their ability to intercept incoming bombers, now faced the threat that operated at will. Bomber crews noticed the transformation as well. Early in the campaign, every mission was flown with tension. The climb to altitude, the long approach, and the final run toward targets were periods marked by constant vigilance. But as the Mustang spread its influence across the Pacific, these moments changed. Gunners saw fewer coordinated attacks. Enemy fighters appeared less frequently and broke off sooner. Radios carried reports of Mustangs clearing airfields hundreds of miles ahead. What had been a contest between bomber formations and determined interceptors had become a coordinated movement in which the United States controlled the rhythm of the battle. For Japanese commanders, this shift carried a deeper implication. Control of the air was slipping away, not because of a single technological breakthrough, but because the Mustang enabled the United States to enforce a new strategic reality. It allowed bombers to strike more frequently. It allowed reconnaissance missions to be conducted with greater safety. It allowed naval operations to proceed with reduced risk. Every advantage multiplied, leaving Japan less able to respond with each passing week. By the summer of 1945, when the Mustang roamed freely over the islands, the meaning of air superiority had changed entirely. Japanese pilots who once believed the Zero's agility made them untouchable now faced an opponent that nullified their strengths before combat even began. The skies above their own homeland, once a sanctuary, now belonged to the aircraft they had once dismissed. The climax of this transformation was not a single decisive battle, but the steady, relentless erosion of an air force that could no longer compete. Every sortie flown by the Mustang pushed Japan closer to a point from which recovery was impossible. Every engagement weakened the remaining structure of its air defenses. The dominance Americans once envied in their opponents had become their own, expressed through a fighter that embodied speed, reach, discipline, and technological mastery. And as Japan's aerial strength faded, the consequences moved beyond the skies. What had begun as an aerial duel evolved into a turning point that reshaped the entire direction of the war, a shift whose aftermath would touch strategy, industry, and the very morale of nations.
When the Mustang finally dominated the skies over Japan, the transformation was not merely tactical, it altered the course of the war's final year. The air battles of 1942, where American pilots fought desperately against a skilled enemy flying superior machines, felt distant. By 1945, the situation had reversed so completely that veteran pilots often described the change as surreal. Losses that once shook entire squadrons became rare events. Missions that had once been gambles with survival turned into operations conducted with confidence and planning rather than fear. The statistical difference underscores how dramatic the shift had been. In the early Pacific War, American fighters often suffered heavy losses against experienced Japanese aviators. The Zero's agility, combined with pilot skill and tactical cohesion, had given Japan clear control of the air. But once the P-51 entered service in the Pacific theater, kill ratios swung sharply. Escort missions that would once have been costly now ended with minimal Mustang losses and significant Japanese attrition. Airfields that had once launched coordinated interceptors found their aircraft destroyed on the ground or scattered before they reached altitude. In some missions, entire bomber formations reached their targets without encountering meaningful resistance. Yet numbers tell only part of the story. The Mustang's arrival reshaped morale across every branch of the U.S. military involved in the Pacific Campaign. Bomber crews who had once watched enemy fighters climb toward them with dread now flew with Mustang shadows overhead, quiet, fast-moving guardians that intercepted threats long before they approached. The psychological relief was profound. Pilots who had lost friends in earlier missions felt the weight lift when they saw the distinctive silhouette of Mustangs forming above them. Many described hearing the calm voices of Mustang escorts on the radio as a reassurance that the mission could proceed as planned. For the Japanese, the aftermath was far more troubling. Reports from surviving pilots reveal a deepening sense of inevitability as the war entered its final months. Early in the conflict, Japanese aviators had flown with a belief in their aircraft, their training, and their tactical doctrine. But by 1945, they faced an opponent with a machine faster than anything they could field in large numbers and piloted by airmen whose training pipeline had grown stronger with each passing year. Fuel shortages limited training flights, replacement aircraft arrived too slowly, and the Mustang remained unforgiving to any error. Japanese commanders attempted various countermeasures, dispersing aircraft, shifting airfields, relying on ambush tactics, but none restored the balance. The Mustang's range allowed it to reach deeper than expected, often catching aircraft during relocation or fueling. Its speed enabled large sweeps that overwhelmed defenses, and its reliability meant it returned from missions ready to fly again the next day. The long-term effect was cumulative. Every sortie flown by the Mustang eroded Japan's ability to resist. Even the Zero, once revered as a symbol of Japanese air power, showed its age under the new conditions. Built for agility at the cost of protection, it suffered catastrophic damage under Mustang gunfire. Dogfights that once showcased the Zero's precision now revealed its limitations in an era where speed and altitude ruled the sky. Pilots who once celebrated the Zero's unique abilities now remarked that they faced an opponent designed for a different, more modern war. The Mustang's effect extended beyond combat encounters. It secured airspace for naval movements, allowing U.S. forces to advance island by island with reduced risk of aerial attack. It protected reconnaissance flights that mapped invasion routes. It supported operations that, without air superiority, would have faced delay or greater casualties. In this sense, the Mustang did not simply dominate the air. It reshaped every operation conducted beneath it. And as Japan's ability to contest the skies faded, the final phase of the conflict came into view. What had once been a struggle against a confident, well-trained opponent was becoming a campaign against a weakened and outmatched force, one whose pilots now stepped into aircraft knowing the odds were against them. The consequences of that shift would become even clearer as the war neared its end.
By the time Mustang operations reached their peak in 1945, Japan's air arm was no longer capable of shaping outcomes on the battlefield. The decline did not occur all at once. It unfolded in waves, each tied to a loss of territory, a disrupted supply chain, or the attrition of another group of trained aviators. Yet the arrival of the Mustang did more than accelerate this decline. It ensured that any attempt at recovery would be cut short. Its presence over the Japanese home islands signaled that the era of Japanese aerial initiative had ended, replaced by a new reality in which American aircraft could project power wherever necessary, with little effective resistance. This shift forced Japanese strategists to reevaluate their remaining options. Without a viable fighter force to intercept bombers or disrupt naval movements, they turned increasingly to defensive measures that relied on endurance rather than dominance. Camouflage, dispersal, and passive defenses became common practices. Aircraft were hidden in forests, caves, or makeshift shelters to avoid destruction on the ground. Pilots were briefed to conserve fuel, avoid unnecessary engagements, and prioritize survival when possible. Yet these measures offered only marginal protection against a fighter capable of sweeping entire regions in a single mission. Post-war assessments from both Japanese and American perspectives reveal a consistent theme. The Mustang represented a new threshold in fighter design. It offered the speed and altitude performance of an interceptor, the endurance of a long-range escort, and the firepower of a frontline combat aircraft. These elements, combined with the vast American industrial base and refined training doctrine, created a level of sustained pressure that Japan could not counter. Even promising Japanese aircraft, such as the K-84 and N-1K-2J, which in different circumstances might have challenged the Mustang, appeared too late and in too few numbers to influence strategic outcomes. For American pilots, the Mustang became more than a tool of war. It became a symbol of the turning tide. Many who transitioned from earlier fighters described the experience as transformative. They spoke of flying an aircraft that responded sharply, climbed without hesitation, and maintained energy through maneuvers that earlier fighters could only attempt briefly. With each mission, they witnessed firsthand how the Mustang extended the reach of U.S. air power. They saw enemy formations break apart under coordinated attacks, watched bombers cross dangerous regions with newfound safety, and recognized that their contribution was reshaping the conflict's momentum. As the war neared its conclusion, the Mustang continued to serve not only as an escort, but as a multi-role aircraft. It strafed airfields, attacked transportation networks, and supported ground operations, ensuring that every Japanese effort to reinforce or reorganize faced immediate aerial disruption. These missions further limited Japan's ability to prepare defenses for the inevitable Allied advances. By the summer of 1945, airspace over much of the country was effectively under American control, and the Mustang had become one of the primary instruments enforcing that dominance. In retrospect, what makes the Mustang's impact so significant is not simply its performance, but the timing of its arrival. Had it appeared earlier, it might have shifted the balance sooner. Had it appeared later, Japan's defensive decline might have unfolded differently. Instead, it arrived at the precise moment when American industry, training, and operational needs converged, and at a moment when Japan's ability to produce experienced pilots and reliable aircraft was rapidly diminishing. Japanese pilots who survived the war rarely spoke of the Mustang with the dismissive tone they once used for early American fighters. Many acknowledged its strengths openly, describing it as fast, relentless, and unassailable when flown with energy. Their reflections underscore the reality that the aircraft they once mocked had become the defining symbol of American air power in the war's final year. With Japan's aerial resistance broken and the sky firmly under American control, the broader outcome of the conflict moved towards its final chapters. And as the war approached its end, the significance of this transformation invited a deeper reflection on how technology, training, and determination can reshape the balance between nations.
In the final accounting of the Pacific War, the story of Japan's early aerial dominance and America's eventual reversal of fortune reveals more than a contest of machines. It reflects the pace at which war accelerates innovation, reshapes doctrines, and transforms expectations. The Zero, once unmatched in its agility and flown by the finest aviators Japan had ever trained, dominated a battlefield shaped by surprise, preparation, and the momentum of an experienced force. Its pilots mocked early American fighters because in those first months, the imbalance was undeniable. The P-39, the P-40, the P-36 all fought with courage, yet all carried limitations that made confrontation with the Zero a dangerous undertaking. But war rarely freezes in place. It evolves with every loss, every lesson, every breakthrough, and every response born from necessity. The Mustang was one such response, not an overnight miracle, but the product of engineering insight, industrial capacity, and the determination of a nation unwilling to allow early failures to define its fate. When the Mustang arrived, it did more than match the Zero. It altered the very conditions that had allowed the Zero to thrive. It brought altitude to fights where the Zero had relied on maneuver. It brought speed to engagements where the Zero had exploited hesitation, and it brought range to a theater where distance had always been Japan's advantage. In doing so, the Mustang changed not only tactical outcomes, but strategic ones. It provided security where there had been doubt, initiative where there had been caution, and momentum where there had once been delay. Japanese pilots who once mocked American fighters ended the war facing an opponent that reflected the full weight of American adaptation. The legacy of this transformation extends far beyond 1945. It illustrates how air superiority, once claimed through agility and instinct, evolved into a contest defined by technology, endurance, training, and the ability to learn faster than the enemy. The Mustang, sleek and powerful, embodied that evolution. It arrived at the moment when the war demanded something new, and in answering that demand, it reshaped the skies above the Pacific and left a mark on aviation history that endures long after the conflict ended.